In a dimly lit conference room at Cape Canaveral in February 1962, three men sat around a table covered with star charts that had nothing to do with navigation. Dr. Robert Harrison, a senior trajectory analyst for Project Mercury, spread 12 zodiacal diagrams across the polished wood surface while his colleagues watched in uncomfortable silence. What they were about to discuss could end their careers, yet none of them could ignore what the data was showing. For the past 6 months, Harrison had been running an unauthorized parallel analysis, correlating astronaut performance metrics with their birth charts, and the patterns he discovered were statistically impossible to dismiss. It started as a joke during a late-night coffee break. Harrison's wife had given him an astrology book for Christmas, and he had mockingly compared the personality descriptions to the psychological profiles NASA kept on every astronaut candidate. But then something strange happened. The correlations were not random. Fire sign astronauts showed measurably faster reaction times under pressure. Earth signs demonstrated superior endurance during centrifuge testing. Water signs had the lowest cortisol levels during simulated emergencies. Air signs scored highest on spatial reasoning tests. Harrison spent 3 months trying to disprove his own findings, running the numbers backward, forward, and sideways. Every statistical test he performed only strengthened the relationship. The probability of these patterns occurring by chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The implications terrified him more than they excited him. If astrological patterns had any predictive validity, even small amounts, then everything he believed about rational science was incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. Harrison was a man who had spent 15 years mastering orbital mechanics, differential equations, and Newtonian physics. He had helped calculate the trajectories that would soon put human beings into space. The idea that planetary positions at birth could influence human psychology contradicted everything his education had taught him. Yet the data refused to cooperate with his skepticism. The patterns persisted across every test group, every control variable, every attempt at falsification. The other two men at the table, James Chen and Margaret Wolfe, had initially treated Harrison's findings as the obsession of an overworked mind. But Harrison had brought them evidence they could not ignore. Chen, a statistician responsible for risk assessment protocols, had independently verified the correlations using blind datasets. He did not know which astronauts corresponded to which birth charts when he ran his analysis. The patterns emerged anyway. Wolfe, a neurologist consulting on the physiological effects of spaceflight, had found something even more disturbing in the medical records. Astronauts born during certain planetary alignments showed identical anomalies in their brainwave patterns during high-stress simulations. The differences were subtle but measurable, appearing in the delta wave frequencies during REM sleep cycles. What made the situation more complicated was what they had discovered about the upcoming Mercury missions. John Glenn, scheduled to be the first American to orbit Earth, was a Cancer with his moon in Capricorn. According to both the ancient astrological texts and Harrison's modern correlations, this combination produced individuals with exceptional emotional control under sustained isolation, but also a specific vulnerability. Cancer Capricorn subjects showed a documented tendency toward visual hallucinations during prolonged sensory deprivation. The phenomenon appeared in 73% of test subjects with this natal configuration. NASA's own isolation chamber experiments, conducted without any astrological framework, had noted that Glenn reported seeing geometric patterns and fleeting shadows during his longest endurance test. The mission psychologists had dismissed it as normal perceptual drift. But Harrison's data suggested it might be predictable, possibly even dangerous at critical moments. The three scientists faced an impossible choice. If they reported their findings through official channels, they would be laughed out of the space program. Astrology was pseudoscience, superstition, the domain of carnival fortune tellers and desperate housewives. No serious researcher could advocate for its use in mission planning without destroying their credibility. But if they remained silent and Glenn experienced a critical hallucination during re-entry, when split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and incineration, they would carry that responsibility forever. Chen had calculated the risk probabilities. If their correlations held true, there was a 19% chance of Glenn experiencing a significant perceptual distortion during the mission's most dangerous phases. They decided on a middle path that felt like cowardice and wisdom in equal measure. They would not mention astrology. Instead, they would recommend additional psychological screening protocols that happened to filter for the exact vulnerabilities their astrological analysis had identified. They would suggest modified communication procedures during isolation phases that would help ground astronauts experiencing perceptual anomalies. They would advocate for backup contingencies that addressed the specific failure modes their research predicted. The recommendations would be buried in technical language, justified by conventional psychology and neurology, stripped of any reference to zodiacal patterns or planetary influences. The science would be real even if they could not speak its true origin. What they could not know, sitting in that conference room with their forbidden knowledge, was that similar discoveries were happening in secret research facilities across both sides of the Iron Curtain. Soviet scientists had been studying biorhythms and cosmic ray effects on human psychology since the late 1950s. A classified program in Moscow had identified correlations between solar flare activity and pilot error rates that closely matched astrological predictions about Mars transits. Chinese researchers, working from ancient texts that merged astronomy and medicine, had developed screening protocols for their own space program that were essentially astrological even if they never used that word. The knowledge was fragmentary, hidden, approached from different cultural frameworks, but pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The truth was that astrology did not work the way its popular practitioners claimed. Birth charts could not predict specific events or determine destiny, but they did appear to correlate with certain neurological patterns, possibly influenced by variations in Earth's magnetic field at different times of year, or by subtle gravitational effects from planetary alignments, or by mechanisms that nobody yet understood. The correlation was weak, statistically significant, but far from deterministic. It was less like a law of physics and more like a predisposition, a slight adjustment to baseline probabilities that only became visible when analyzing large populations under extreme conditions. Space travel, with its unprecedented stresses and precise requirements, created exactly the circumstances where subtle patterns became critical variables. Glenn's mission proceeded with the additional protocols Harrison's team had recommended. During his second orbit, while passing over the Indian Ocean in complete radio silence, he reported seeing fireflies outside his capsule window. Mission control, following the new communication procedures, helped him remain oriented without dismissing his experience. He completed the mission successfully, becoming an American hero. The perceptual phenomenon was later attributed to ice particles illuminated by sunlight, but Glenn's own logs noted that the patterns seemed to move in ways that defied physics. Years later, after his political career, in private conversations with researchers studying altered states of consciousness, he would admit that he had seen other things during that flight. Geometric patterns that seemed almost intelligent, a sense of vast presence in the void. Experiences that matched precisely what Harrison's astrological analysis had predicted for a Cancer-Capricorn subject under extended isolation. The knowledge remained compartmentalized, passed between trusted colleagues, never officially acknowledged. By the time of the Apollo missions, informal astrological screening had become part of the astronaut selection process, hidden inside psychological assessments and stress tolerance protocols. The scientists involved justified it as pattern recognition, as empirical correlation, as anything except what it actually represented. They had discovered that ancient wisdom contained fragments of observable truth, but the institutional structure of modern science had no framework for integrating that discovery. So it remained in the shadows, influential but invisible, shaping decisions without ever appearing in official documents. Harrison himself became increasingly conflicted as the years progressed. He had opened a door that could not be closed, glimpsed a layer of reality that defied comfortable categorization. His private research expanded beyond astronaut selection into broader questions about consciousness and cosmic influence. He began corresponding with researchers in India who had been studying Vedic astrology's connections to Ayurvedic medicine, finding unexpected overlaps with his own data. He discovered that ancient Babylonian astronomical records contained observations about planetary cycles and human behavior that showed remarkable sophistication. What he had dismissed as primitive superstition began to look more like an alternative scientific framework, one that had been abandoned during the Enlightenment not because it was false, but because it was methodologically inconvenient. The astronauts themselves sensed something strange about the selection process, but could never quite identify what. They noticed that certain personality combinations seemed overrepresented in mission assignments. They joked about lucky birth months and unlucky ones. When 3 astronauts born in early March all reported similar psychological responses to isolation training, it became part of crew culture folklore. Nobody connected it to the fact that all 3 had their sun in Pisces with strong Neptune aspects, exactly the configuration Harrison's research had flagged for heightened sensitivity to sensory deprivation. By 1968, as preparations for the Apollo 11 moon landing intensified, Harrison's shadow influence had become deeply embedded in NASA's operational procedures. Neil Armstrong, chosen to be the first human to walk on another world, had a birth chart that Harrison had privately analyzed months before the final crew selection. The combination of Leo Sun with Virgo rising suggested someone who could handle historic pressure while maintaining meticulous attention to technical detail. When Armstrong famously kept his cool during the lunar module's computer alarms, manually piloting to a safe landing with only seconds of fuel remaining, Harrison watched from mission control knowing that the psychological profile had predicted exactly the capacity for calm precision under existential threat. But the deepest secret, the one Harrison never shared even with Chen and Wolf, was what he had discovered about the moon itself. Ancient astrological texts attributed profound psychological effects to lunar phases and positions, claims that modern science had thoroughly dismissed. Yet Harrison's analysis of astronaut sleep patterns, emotional stability metrics, and decision-making quality showed undeniable correlations with lunar cycles. The effects were subtle in Earth normal conditions, but became dramatically amplified in space. Astronauts orbiting during full moons reported significantly higher rates of vivid dreams and emotional intensity. Those who performed spacewalks during new moons showed measurably different stress hormone profiles than those who worked during waxing crescents. The moon, it seemed, genuinely did affect human psychology, not through mystical forces, but through mechanisms that nobody had bothered to study because the association with astrology had made the entire subject intellectually taboo. What would have happened if they had been honest? If Harrison had published his findings, subjected them to peer review, forced the scientific community to confront evidence that contradicted materialist assumptions? The answer is unknowable, lost in the branching paths of history not taken. Perhaps the ridicule would have been so complete that legitimate research would have been set back decades. Perhaps a serious investigation would have revealed deeper principles about consciousness and cosmic influences. Perhaps the space program itself would have been compromised by association with pseudoscience during the height of the Cold War, when American technological supremacy needed to appear absolutely rational and superior. Or perhaps in some other timeline, astrology and astronomy would have reunited, creating a new science that understood human consciousness as genuinely connected to celestial patterns, not through magic but through principles that conventional physics had not yet developed the tools to measure. The data was real, the correlations persisted, but the courage to speak them openly never materialized, and so the knowledge remained forever half hidden influencing history from the margins while official records told a simpler story.